to start with a little bit of a personal anecdote that kind of represents things I've heard from a number of other tech meetings, including this one, and that I love hearing the goal of replacing physicians, surgeons, radiologists by robots and other technologies. I mean, I'm very serious about it because I think that when we get there, that means I'll be doing another job that's really cool and still contributing to healthcare. So I have actually no fear. I'm really excited, and I actually may help to replace myself. But when I think about the grounding comments that were made, Lisa talking about, we've got to remember the patient. Rich, it's all about quality, and that's what we're really after. And so my question for you all, when I think about quality of life for the patient, I have to admit there's a little bit of selfish pride, I think, about quality of life for the physicians that provide the care for the patients. And I don't mean like at home, I mean the quality in the workflow, the system with all the data, with all of, the inputs, and you're trying to make a decision. There's a lot of issues that get in the way of the patient and quality. So for each of you, my question at a high level, when you think about your technologies and the things that you are doing, what data is missing from the patient or the physician? What would help you replace the physician? What data is missing for you to get to that next level? You want to start, Rich? Go ahead. Thank you.
I actually really, one of the points that I like to emphasize when it comes to, it's not necessarily replacing the physician. When I was doing the robot for stroke therapy, I would tell the therapist that I wasn't replacing you, I'm immortalizing you. And so part of what you want to do is capture that best practice and then be able to make it available to other people. And what we often overlook is, so think about we rank our hospitals and we actually have quality measures, which means some people are better at quality than others. There's actually some people that aren't even getting the care that they need, let alone getting it at a certain quality. So to me, these kinds of technologies, going back to that point of democratizing access to quality, it actually makes it available to people that aren't even getting it. They had a zero experience, let alone a bad experience. But the thing that's missing sometimes, I think, and what I've learned in the work that I've done is that you have to have a process of how you use the data when you're introducing a new platform, and you can't go from a new robot to full understanding of how it changes the world. You actually have to really take a stepwise approach to using the first bit of data, showing how it affects the process appropriately, growing that information to the next level, and it's really a progression. And I think that's something we haven't really defined well enough, is that how we manage that progression of introducing these new platforms that then get us to the end result.
Yeah, and you're reminding me of Eric Dishman. Quality is relative, right? I mean, he wants to be optimized for snow at one point in his time and then optimized for planting. But if we don't have the metrics there, then we can't manage that and get to that.
I think, first of all, I'm delighted we're talking about replacing doctors and not venture capitalists. But I think
that would be a mistake. I agree with
the
you.
data that's often missing is the feedback loop. I think I talked earlier about, I see entrepreneurs that have never talked to patients. I see entrepreneurs developing things for physicians that have never talked to physicians, or few, maybe themselves in the mirror. And, I think the advent of technology has actually has a lot of promise for the clinical world in terms of optimizing, their ability to focus on their knowledge and not just the process itself, and all the time spent on EMRs and all the documentation challenges and the like. And so you hear things like, physicians would like voice-activated, reporting and all sorts of stuff. But a lot of the technologies, I think, haven't been proven. They haven't stood the test of trying them out and demonstrating validity and efficacy in the audience intended. They're just sort of put out there as cool stuff. And those who are entrepreneurs in the audience, I would encourage you to spend the extra time, really trying, going through the user experience, whoever the user may be, and if it's the physician or the nurse or whomever it is, because so much of what's been introduced into the health systems has been time expanding, not time improving, or experience misery, misery expanding. It's not helpful.
Yeah, first of all, I love the question, and as a doc, maybe I'll become a venture capitalist and act based off of Lisa's comments, but I think particularly when you think about enabling technology, enabling physicians, and allowing patients to do the work themselves is incredibly powerful. So the analogy that I think of is Coumadin Clinic, and I don't know how many docs are out in the clinic, out in the audience here, but none of us were really complained when we got to send our patient to Coumadin Clinic so someone else could then go measure their INR level, right? And then there was a movement where patients could actually measure their own INR level and adjust their own medications, and the literature showed they did it great, right? And so this idea around taking the data and giving it to people to help them, empower them to manage their own health is incredibly, I think, liberating, and allowing physicians to practice on the things that maybe you actually need to go to medical school to do, or the special subset of skills that are at the highest level of your degree. I think there's something that's really empowering there.
Yeah, that gets at health literacy. And I don't mean reading, obviously. It's more hacking your own healthcare and being aware of what your preference is for quality. You have to state it, what it is. Eric shared a lot of that. And the same, navigating the healthcare system and understanding what you want from your physician, what relationship you want. I love to talk about matching, patients with their physician, and I imagine there's a whole bunch of variables that would go into that. But yes, there's a lot there. Anything for you?
Well, in mental health, I think all of these answers are relevant. We're in the midst of a really serious paradigm shift for mental health because we have explosion of insights from neuroscience. We have a field that has no data-based model, so we're new at the seat at the table. I think what's really important for the patients is changing the narrative, changing it so we actually have a data-based way to understand what's going on, that it's not about this is my moral weakness, my character flaw, I'm not trying hard enough. And that we see in our kind of grassroots lab to clinic experience. If you can share with the patients, this is what's happening in your brain, similarly to if you're trying to understand what's happening in your heart for a heart disease or multiple other systems, it is very empowering, and it gives a way to actually engage in the intervention. I think change behavior, as you are highlighting. And for the clinicians, the docs, in psychiatry, it is a discipline where we have time with the patients, but that time is not optimized without data. It's really a matter of an interaction about observations right now. So I think this whole kind of data health initiative, precision health, is set to transform mental health.
No, thank you all for those answers. I actually can't see because the lights are so bright, but if you all have questions, please start lining up. We'll be happy to have some questions, please.
So, my question is regarding the mental health diagnostic, and I want to see what kind of data points we have to do the diagnostic here, especially mental health being tricky in the sense that a person might not know they might have a disorder. Any some sort of contextual information in that, in terms of, for example, Facebook, I was reading news that they rolled something out. They can figure out if someone has suicidal thoughts through, their way of their expressing themselves or something like that. Yeah.
There's some great initiatives happening in terms of actually bringing this to the community for a discussion, and to actually, if someone searches for, I think I'm depressed, it is sending them to get a screen. I think that's really important, and it's actually putting this center stage. That information is also important, same as in any area of health. We need to know what the person's experiencing. The challenge, I think, is how do we actually interpret this data and how do we make it actionable? And in other areas of health, we can think about, it does make sense how someone's responding on their smartphone or the heart rate changes because we already have a model. We already have a model based on understanding the biological system or the virus or the tissue. We do not have that for diagnoses in mental health. We have a checklist that is reliable. We can communicate one doc to another, one researcher to another, but it doesn't tie to the biology or what is actually underlying it.
But there's been some really interesting patient-generated data programs too, and maybe they're not considered as scientific, but I guess if how a person presents in the behavioral health world, for at least for the simpler diagnoses, is how they feel, then they're reporting how they feel when they're treated is probably as good as anything, for some period of time, right? And I know like GoodRx has a product that, when somebody starts an antidepressant, which by and large don't work for most people, the first one they get by and large doesn't work for them, and they have to change, sometimes many times before they get the right thing, if it works at all. At least it gives a feedback loop so you don't go without, an intervention if that particular first drug you took or the second one doesn't work. So I think at least some of those patient-generated data models are pretty interesting.
And important for access, I think, because right now I think we estimate only 5 to 10% of people are getting help for mental health issues. Most of them are in community or primary care settings. So those initiatives I think are really important, especially if someone's at risk, like if they're thinking suicidal thoughts and so on.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I mean, I think about, even just having some understanding of potential triggers. I mean, just as you said, as Jenny was mentioning, you go see your doctor once a month or once or twice a year, and then the rest of the time it's you. And in your case, it's that person in their brain, and things are happening the whole time, and we don't really have an understanding of all the inputs that can actually be triggers that they may not be aware of just by location or activity or the weekly schedule, things that are happening. So that's really exciting. Who's next? Here.
My question, I think, addresses, it's directed mainly to Dr. Schneider. So my question is about the risk prediction for incident diabetes. So we have existing risk scores, mainly generated from the cohort studies, readily available clinical data. What's your thought about using this big data, machine learning, to give us new risk prediction models for chronic disease, in particular type 2 diabetes? Where are we in that regard?
So I think that I love the question. I heard the question is there's a lot of new data happening in the real world, right? In the likes of a Livongo or other platforms that are collecting data on people with chronic conditions who are doing everyday, day-to-day stuff. What can we do to leverage that data, both in risk prediction and in outcomes? And there's a lot of interest and a lot of work. We have a partnership with Lilly, for example, to do some real-world evidence outcomes and risk prediction out of the data that we're collecting, because it's frankly outside of a clinical trial and a retrospective IRB data approval to be able to look at that data. So I think it's really enticing, really exciting, and I think the question then becomes how can we leverage that real-world data outside, outside of a controlled clinical trial to actually make healthcare and medicine move faster. And that, I think, has a little bit, is still to be seen. There's a lot of talks going on at the FDA in that vein around how you can start to design and think about trials. So really exciting space to be in, for sure.
See, and that makes me question. I don't think I haven't heard much at this conference, but a few folks have talked about, HIPAA and patient privacy of data, but it seems that this whole conference should just blow that out of the water. I mean, if you want to get better, you kind of have to share your data. That's what it sounds like. I mean, are you having those types of issues with your patients sharing across? How does that work?
Yeah, so we're HIPAA secure. We sell to large self-insured employers, and some of whom have had large data breaches as part of their businesses. And so our security questionnaires that we fill out are like 157 pages. So we're incredibly secure. But do allow and believe in allowing members, the patients, we call them members, to share their data with whomever they want. And it's interesting, some work that we're just doing now looks at if you share your blood glucose data with your doc, or if you share your blood glucose data with your friends and family, what are your outcomes? And the outcomes are statistically significantly better if you share that data with your friends and family.
Yep.
And so allowing and empowering the individual patient or member to share the data with their care team, which includes the doc to some degree, but a far lesser degree than the current emphasis.
Yep.
I read an article this week about, I can't remember if it was in Chicago or LA, I don't remember the city, but they were equipping barbers and barber shops in somewhat underserved communities to take blood pressure readings and counsel people on taking medication. Mm-hmm. And the profound drop in blood pressure points compared to the medical interventions was notable. And I think obviously that's not a HIPAA secure environment, but I think most people don't care that much about sharing their data when they want help. I think they don't want to share it, with the Russians without permission, but they want to share it with their peers, and they want to share it with their physicians, and they want to share it with their family members, and that doesn't freak them out for the most part. It's sometimes more difficult to get past HIPAA than it is to actually do what you want.
Yeah, and that's linking health outcomes to daily routines. That's the best way to really get people to be aware and do something. All right, I'm just going back and forth.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Matthew. I'm a neurologist here, and I appreciate this conversation very much. My training's in population statistics, and you're right. Most people really want to know how to share their data, and they don't know how. And I'm very happy to hear about the kind of blockchain-based things that were being proposed or being done, so people can be incentivized to share their data. That'll probably help a lot. Dr. Williams, my question is for you, and it has to do with the conversation you were just having on the imaging or otherwise, the surrogate markers for mood disorder. I think that as soon as we can get the intracranial data out, that the data analysis teams will actually be able to, in relatively short order, figure out how to solve these problems that we don't even know how to ask the right questions for. So my question for you is, what are the methods of getting that data out for mood, other things, psychosis, all those things? Because as you mentioned, what we do now is we say, have you felt bad lately? And unfortunately, lots of times people don't feel better at all when they're actually doing much better, or the other way, they feel terrible, but they're, they feel great, but they're not doing any better. Right. And so that's the question, is how are we getting the data out?
It's a great question. You mean in terms of being able to use it, like clinically?
Yeah.
I think it's a operations question right now, in terms of how do you turn around the data once it's acquired from a scanner? How do you turn around, quantify, and push it to a report or to the medical record? And that exists here in our system in a very rough beta version. And the issue is how, based on our current models that have this accuracy of 75 to 80%, if we push this out into a real clinic population, how generalizable will that be when you've got all the issues that happen in a standard clinical facility? So that's one issue, doing scalable studies to test that. And engineering-wise, actually generating that pipeline is the same way as would be the case in many of the applications you'd use in neurology. You can get the readout from the scan sent to the medical record, probably
right.
smartphone.
That's exactly the problem, is that the economy of scale doesn't work if a human being is always the person who's responsible for seeing and reading.
And doesn't need to be. So this approach we have of how to actually have reproducible metrics, that is one solution for doing it, because we can extract, as long as the scan is ordered in the same way each time it's used, as it would be in other areas of health, we can generate those metrics. The second issue is just testing out the reimbursement, and that's just doing it. I think it's just actually making a decision to do it.
But the cost of scanning every person who presents for behavioral health, diagnosis would be prohibitive, right?
I always get asked this question.
It is. We couldn't possibly do that.
Well, I challenge that, actually, because one big picture issue is, what value do we put on a human life? We have enormously expensive procedures in most other areas of health, and the cost comes down when they're used. If you broke your leg and you didn't get a scan, and you said, okay, just try hopping around for a bit, see if it gets better, come back and see me in 8 weeks, you'd be horrified. I mean, standard, absolutely standard. So I'm definitely not an advocate of saying we should scan everyone. I'm just saying it's feasible based on our other areas of health to try this model and go after the proxy metrics that could say when is it that you might consider coming in for a scan. If your own behavioural change or other interventions haven't worked, there may be an indicator to say, actually come in and have this. So I guess it's expensive, but I don't think it's more expensive than the current cost. And if you estimate the current cost, each employer is losing $13,000 a year for each person who has depression because of their presenteeism, not being able to perform at work. The cost of not getting the medication right or any intervention is enormous. We just don't have that quantified as we do for other areas of health. So I think it needs to be tested.
Fair enough.
Thank you. Greg Siegel actually has a paper about that in depression. It didn't get accepted. I was a reviewer and I screwed up. Advocate enough. It was about cost-optimized sequential algorithms. And so they tested the basic demographic clinical variables. How well can we predict people? And you could predict 70% accurately with those. Then the next tier of predictors that were more expensive, then the next one. And so you wouldn't have to do EEG and FMRI on everyone, but you might be able to identify the subset of people who need the more expensive ones, and it might be more cost-effective that way. It was a cool paper.
Greg does great work, and I think of it as similar to one analogy would be in cardiac medicine, where we now have good surrogate indicators of when someone may be moving into a risk state, and they can be assessed remotely, and a point at which you say, actually, it's time to come in and get your scan or your EKG or whatever. And I think that's what Greg Siegel is arguing for.
Yeah, thank you. So my question was actually for you as well. When you're doing this sort of transdiagnostic work, and I love that you both were looking at the biological data, but also the self-report. And in depression, one of our big problems is we think about depression as depression, and really it's many things. But I was wondering how you think about what we do once we break depression into the things that it actually is, because we'll have treatments that target those things, but how do you reimburse for them? How do you deal with people who on a dimensional have some anhedonia and some sleep disturbance? So you're innovating in this area. What do we do once we figure more out? Because it seems complicated.
It is complicated. Fantastic question. My belief is there's many areas that we need to pursue and accelerate, and one of them would be the prospective trials, where you could do it on scale, ideally in cohort studies with people earlier on, where you're actually taking all these data points, and then you can say, based on what we currently know, the predictive models, say a threshold of 0.7 and above accuracy, let's actually guide someone to a particular intervention and assess the real-world outcomes and the impact on the health spend as well, and actually test at what point does this really make a difference.
Hi, my question is actually to do with patient adherence to the process of data collection, and I'd like your comments on it. So in the case of chronic diseases, if you have to collect longitudinal data, do the patients always provide that? In case of depression, when people can't even get off the bed or couch, do they even show up in the clinic? In case of devices and these digital fashion, the adherence is less than 6 months for Fitbits, they say. So how do you deal with that? Can you comment on that? And then finally, when it comes to funding companies which are based on this, how much of that is a factor? Do you look at how much these companies are looking at adherence strategies? So your comments on that, please.
So maybe I'll start on that one. We found that allowing or making the collection of data as easy as possible is what you have to do. Not it's nice, you actually have to do it. And so an example is, so if nobody wants to do more. No one with a chronic condition or health problem is like, I want to do 4 more things today, right? They actually want to do way less, right? They want an outcome and they want to do less. So one of the learnings we've had is all of our data collection, our blood glucose meter is cellular enabled, not Bluetooth. And so that feels like maybe a slight difference, but think about all the Bluetooth devices you have in your world and when they kind of go awry and how often you take that next step to actually reconnect them. Not often. And so in our case, it's literally you stick a blood glucose strip in, the member does nothing different than they did with their meters that didn't collect data. There's no change for them, but we capture that data. And so I think it's the design of the data capture by putting yourself in the shoes and the feet of the patient that makes all the difference. And little things matter. So we designed a blood glucose carrying case for people when they check their blood glucose. So they can, those of us who do it, we either immediately stick our bloody finger in our mouth or we wipe it on something. That's real. We designed a basic black absorbent case so that people are actually incented to use our case that looks like it's a piece of their purse, something else that they would have. So invested a fair amount of money in the design of the case. So again, it's all around this human-centered design principle as we allow and enable people to capture data.
Well, that's kind of nasty that people have bloody cases in their purses, but I
But
think
real world.
fair enough. On the funding side, I think this is a real issue for me, and I think for others. The vast majority of products that are focused on adherence have failed. There's at least 10 billion companies that have tried to do, medication adherence products, and none of them, I will venture to say, have made a material difference in medication adherence. And so I think whenever you're relying on the patient, and forgive me for whoever I'm about to offend, but whenever, and myself included, whenever you need to rely on the patient to actively engage in adherence, you're not likely to be successful if it's a long-term requirement. And so I think passive sensors and passive methodologies for gaining data are really essential, or working on things that require short-term adherence for products like that for companies that are fundable. But when it's a long-term thing, it's really tough. I mean, I'm always amused by all the conversation I participate in about data and how big data and all this data and AI and all that. We know that if you have high blood pressure and somebody hands you lisinopril, you should take it, but yet people don't. You don't need a lot of data for that piece of information right there. So, I think it's just a very difficult thing to change human behavior, and without making it virtually imperceptible by the patient, does it work?
In my case, the way we're approaching that is that the power assist in the suit is the real value differentiation. So that has to work. So and we're also approaching it initially as a wellness product. So I've done medical rehab products, and I know I could make this technology successful in that domain. But at this stage of my career, I want the high bar of creating a really usable product that is consumer facing. And believe me, when I'm sitting across from the VCs, it's not an easy conversation because of the number of wearable technologies that are really not being adopted. But at the end of the day, I have to show that power assist is really differentiated and people will use it. And then the data story grows off of that. So now we have a platform that can be used. We can tell if someone's not getting up off the couch and use it for other or use that information for other purposes, but we need to show we have a really good product first.
No, thank Rich for that, because I was thinking of connecting this conversation back to what you're doing, and there's a whole lot there, but we'll have to wait. I mean, I'm thinking about how are you capturing information from the brain, from the surgeons and the clinicians that you're doing with your robot, but just the wearable in itself, that's not a ring like I'm wearing or a watch or some of they all have different types of capabilities in terms of finding their way into your work and life routine, that then you can have an accountability partner if you end up sharing the data with family and friends or coworkers. I mean, I think there's some things that I haven't heard that I'm thinking about on this stage as I'm listening to you all, where there's a lot of opportunities.
Guilt is a powerful motivator.
Oh, it is. And we all love company, right? Misery loves company. Like, right, great, I have to take this medication. I do too. Great, let's do it together. Last question.
I'm Mark. I'm with a company called With Health, which is trying to drive personalized telemedicine supported by genomics deeper into the medical specialties, and it's been successful to date. I'm interested in trying to synthesize yesterday's message around understanding diversity in the all of us and the Google research, making sure that we capture different elements of our population, both age and gender and race and background. And I'm curious how you're building that into chronic disease management, or even what you're defining as 5 different sort of typical abnormalities representative of depression. Are you personalizing those elements into different approaches? You talked about 10 different approaches to maybe 100 to having your kids make their bed, right? How do you communicate that? Or how are you tailoring your approach of what is typical to differences in our populations, and applying that into what you're doing?
Yeah, I think about that in 2 different buckets that ultimately come under one umbrella, which is to say genomics, personalized medicine, which medications work for which people under very distinct criteria. And you can really start to sub-cohort that. The information that we have today is incredible. And a lot of the work that you all are doing out there is amazing. And that is very vast. Yet I still see that as slightly more limited than the second bucket, which is then how do you get somebody to actually do that, right? And the second bucket, today our approach has been let's take a sub-defined cohort here and then start to experiment on hundreds of thousands of messages, the words, when you deliver them, how you deliver them, and then follow with the subsequent behavior. And we do that in a closed loop in our system for blood glucose checking and blood pressure checking, because we then follow what the values are and so start to see if someone has taken the actions that we've recommended, or if the message that we've given has resulted in the end result, which is really important. We do that on a reinforcement learning platform, so it gets smarter. So every time somebody comes in and you look like Carla or you look like Lisa, we learn people who look like them and have responded in the right direction based off of certain messages. And we give you that message first. If you don't respond, then we give you a second one. And so we're iteratively learning in that process. That's how we've set up our whole product. But recognize there's also this healthcare component, right? Genomics, medicine that is also evolving at the same time, and that those 2 have to be married together to drive the ultimate outcomes.
Yeah, and we haven't even hit on microbiomics and whatever comes after that. I think, like I talked about a company, Evidation, and that part of their sort of secret sauce is they've recruited 2.25 million people to a panel of patients who are willing to be used in studies and trials and to share their data for that purpose. So the company spends a lot of energy ensuring that they have a very diverse population. 2.5 million people is a lot of people. I mean, typical clinical trial, it doesn't look like that. They are in the process of doing a study about causes and impact on chronic pain of different behaviors, and they recruited 10,000 people from their population in a matter of days. And they, optimized for that diversity of socioeconomic status, race, cultural issues, blah, 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 just to make sure that the study they ultimately come out with, the report, has relevance to a broad population. So I think you have to be very deliberate about it.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your questions. And again, staying for the last session, please, a round of applause for our speakers.